Let's watch Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon methodically humiliate Loud and cocky Pam Bondi in heated hearing.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Actually, I think the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Bondi, I'm here. On September 25th, President Trump signed a memorandum known as NSPM 7, purporting to address domestic terrorism. But Americans across the political spectrum were immediately alarmed by the memo's blurring of the line between unlawful conduct and constitutionally protected speech and activity, as well as its call to investigate, prosecute, and dismantle groups that the president and Stephen Miller described without evidence as, quote, an organized campaign of radical left terrorism. Now, counterterrorism experts were further alarmed by the administration's singular focus on left-wing extremism, combined with the sudden deletion from the DOJ website of decades of research and law enforcement analysis, which had concluded that right-wing extremism poses the greatest terrorism threat to Americans. The president's memo broadly and vaguely links violent conduct to ideologies, and it targeted specifically anti-American, anti-Christian, and anti-capitalist beliefs, as well as, quote, hostility to so-called traditional American views on family, religion, and morality, end quote. President Trump has repeatedly and openly, however falsely, tried to brand his political opponents with these sentiments listed in his memo. But as you know, as a lawyer, holding beliefs that the White House disagrees with is not a crime. And the statute defining domestic terrorism requires criminal acts, not just thoughts and ideas. That's why legal experts, nonprofit leaders, religious freedom, and civil rights advocates immediately raised the alarm that the new presidential directive was a politically motivated attack on civil society designed to silence those who disagree with the administration. So, Ms. Bondi, Section 3 of that memo directed you, as Attorney General, to submit to the President and Stephen Miller a list of groups or entities whose members are engaged in acts that meet the definition of domestic terrorism. And then on December 4th, you directed the FBI to work with a variety of law enforcement entities to compile a list of groups and entities engaged in such acts by January 3rd, 2026, and to update that report every 30 days thereafter. So can we assume that you or persons under your direction at the Department of Justice have prepared that list of groups or entities who are designated as domestic terrorist organizations? And I just remind you that's a yes or no question. Did you prepare the list?
I'm not going to answer it yes or no, but what I will say is I know Antifa is part of that. I will talk to you about that.
I'm reclaiming my time. I asked you whether you
an
prepared
Antifa member was arrested in Minneapolis federal court for
my
cyber
time.
stalking.
Did you
they
have
ask a question and don't want an answer.
The answer is yes or no.
Time belongs to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Gentlelady can proceed.
Okay. So will you commit to providing this committee with any list of organizations that you have recommended be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
We will comply with the law in all matters.
Will you commit to provide this committee with your list of entities that you recommend be designated as domestic terrorist organizations?
I'm not going to commit to anything to you because you won't let me answer questions.
Okay. Well, then we do understand that your current position is that you have a secret list of people or groups that you are accusing of domestic terrorism, but you won't share it with Congress. And I'd remind you that when the U.S. government designates an entity as a foreign terrorist organization, it must report that to Congress and to the entity, because the government can make a mistake and the entity has the opportunity to contest it. So your position seems to be that if you falsely designate an American or an American organization as a terrorist group, there's nothing they can do about it. I think we get it. You don't want to answer the question.
No, you don't get anything regarding public safety.
Thank you.
Nothing.
Thank you for the insult. It's clear you didn't come to Congress prepared to answer questions that the American people have every right to have answered, but If you were to prepared to answer truthfully, here's what we expect the facts to show. The administration is keeping lists of Americans who the White House says are engaged in domestic terrorism. Those lists could include Americans who have not committed any acts of terrorism, but simply disagree with this administration, people like Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And your list may include clergy, elected officials, and members of indivisible groups across the country. And those lists likely don't include Proud Boys or Oath Keepers who were actually convicted. Americans have never tolerated political demagogues who use the government to punish people on an enemies list. It brought down McCarthy, it brought down Nixon, and it will bring down this administration as well.
And you're right.
Back.
That's why we're so glad they rescinded the memorandum targeting parents. For goodness sake, as the gentleman from California just pointed out in his 5 minutes.
Because here's the thing that can't be brushed aside or waved away with irritation or talking points. When government power starts operating in secrecy, when oversight is treated like an insult instead of a constitutional requirement, democracy doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes slowly, quietly, and then all at once. This exchange wasn't about personalities. It wasn't about tone. It wasn't even about who interrupted whom. It was about a fundamental question that every free society has to answer clearly. Who watches the people who claim the authority to label others as threats? When an administration asserts the right to secretly categorize Americans as domestic terrorists without transparency, without due process, and without congressional review, it's asking the public to trust power blindly. And history tells us, over and over again, that blind trust is how rights disappear. What makes this especially dangerous is how ordinary the moment is being treated. No dramatic announcement, no emergency declaration, just a memo, a list, and a refusal to explain. That's how normalization works. First trust us. Then it's you don't need to know. And eventually it becomes you don't have a right to ask. The language matters here. When ideology is blurred with violence, when beliefs are treated as precursors to criminality, the definition of threat becomes elastic, stretchy, convenient. And once that happens, the question stops being who deserves scrutiny and becomes who is next. Today it's activists, tomorrow it's journalists, then faith leaders, then elected officials, then anyone who criticizes the wrong policy at the wrong moment. That's not paranoia, that's pattern recognition. And the most unsettling part? None of this requires new laws. None of it requires suspending the Constitution. It only requires officials willing to test how far they can push without resistance. That's why congressional oversight isn't performative. It's preventative. It's the firewall between power and abuse. When officials respond to legitimate questions with hostility instead of clarity, it's not because the questions are unfair. It's because the answers are uncomfortable. This is how democratic backsliding looks in real time. Not with tanks in the streets, but with secrecy justified as safety, with accountability framed as obstruction, with the rule of law quietly bent to serve political ends. And the reason this moment matters so much is because once the public shrugs and moves on, the precedent is set. The next list becomes easier. The next refusal becomes quieter. The next expansion of power becomes harder to challenge. Democracy doesn't survive on good intentions. It survives on transparency, limits, and consequences. When any one of those disappears, the others don't last long behind it. So this wasn't just a heated exchange in a committee room. It was a warning flare. A reminder that rights don't vanish because people stop believing in them. They vanish because people stop defending them. And whether you're progressive, conservative, independent, or politically exhausted altogether, that should matter to you. Because unchecked power never stays pointed in one direction forever. If this breakdown helped clarify why this moment matters, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Tell me whether you think Congress should force transparency here, and what accountability should look like when the executive branch refuses to answer to the people it serves.